It's 1967. The BBC is still meant to be respectable, stiff upper lipped, and faintly educational. And then Ken Russell turns up with Dante's Inferno, a feverish, sweaty portrait of Dante, Gabriel Rossetti, and Elizabeth Siddal that treats Victorian art like an emotional demolition derby. It's scandal, beauty, obsession, and the uncomfortable sense that the past isn't dead. It's just been waiting for the right camera angle. But Russell's chaos isn't the beginning of the story, it's an aftershock. Because if you rewind to 1848, Europe is on the move. And in London, a group of young artists quietly form a secret brotherhood to challenge the establishment, rewrite what counts as truth in art, and make the viewer's gaze feel implicated. In the same year, revolutions erupt in the streets. The Pre-Raphaelites start a revolution on canvas against academic taste, against polite lies, and against the idea that the body is something art can depict without politics. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Alison Smith, Director of Collections and Research at the Wallace Collection, and one of the UK's leading voices on 19th century British art and the Victorian nude. Together, we'll use Russell's outrageous little film as our pop culture trapdoor into the Pre-Raphaelite myth. And then we'll dig into the real insurgency, how 1848 reshaped beauty, morality, and power, why the nude became a battleground, and why the questions Victorians argued over, who gets seen, who gets believed, and who gets to define what's acceptable, are still questions that we're wrestling with now. This is history, for fuck's sake, at its most lush, provocative, and quietly ferocious. Alison, welcome.
Thank you, Sarah.
I'm so pleased that you're joining us on the pod today. And I'm really excited to talk about Ken Russell, about Dante's Inferno, and about the Pre-Raphaelites. So tell us your story. How did you get to being where you are at the Wallace Collection?
Well, that's a long story. So to cut it short, I've worked in museums for many years at the Barber Institute in Birmingham, then at Tate Britain. That's where I became interested in the Pre-Raphaelites, then at the National Portrait Gallery, and now at the Wallace Collection, where there are no Pre-Raphaelite works, I have to say.
Wonderful. So I've rewatched Dante's Inferno because it's the 50th anniversary year coming up. And that's, of course, what we do at History FFS is we try and find sort of cultural connections between our historical time period and our sort of modern cultural icons. And I'm a massive fan of Oliver Reed. And my dad actually played pool with him once in the early 70s in a pub in Wimbledon. And he said that was one of the highlights of his life was playing pool with Oliver Reed. And so I went and I rewatched Dante's Inferno, and there's something so lush, but there's an element of silliness to it. There's an element of that wonderful 1960s sort of challenging sort of art house sort of filmmaking to it. And I guess one of the questions I had for you, because I think you rewatched it recently as well, is what three words would you use to describe Dante's Inferno? And then how fair is it, do you think, to Rossetti and Siddal?
Well, there are lots of words one can use to describe the film. So I guess it's very expressive. It's like a sort of, gothic. There's a gothic element to it, particularly being filmed in black and white. And I think related to that, it's fragmentary, it's episodic. And I think that is deliberate to try and capture the sort of, the look and feel of Pre-Raphaelite paintings. And I think it's really disorientating as well, the way it moves so quickly, and there are these abrupt, shifts from one scene to another. I also agree with you; it's very silly as well. There's a sort of look from the distance of time, it does seem rather absurd. So that brings us on to how fair is it to Rossetti and Siddal? If they were to come alive today, how would they regard themselves? The way they were depicted by Russell. I think in some ways it's rather unfair. Siddal comes across as a sort of, Victorian Twiggy. I think, she has that same sort of 1960s look and the wonderful Cockney accent. and you could say rather a sort of pathetic, a rather annoying figure. And then Rossetti, as portrayed by Oliver Reed, a bit like Bill Sykes in Oliver. I think he's always dark and brooding and Byronic. And again, he seems a bit ridiculous too. I think Rossetti was a wonderful poet, and so a bit of that comes across. And a fascinating artist, as Siddal was herself. So I think maybe what they achieved creatively is slightly rather underplayed in favour of their inner psychology and their tragic love life.
Absolutely. There's a brutality to the way that Oliver Reed plays Rossetti, and that sort of that feels quite sort of a juxtaposition. I also think the filmmaking itself, it reminds me of that sort of early 1920s kind of filmmaking in its episodic nature. There was one particular scene that really stood out to me when and it's Ken Russell who's doing the narration himself, isn't it? And it's describing Siddal being feeding the birds, and she's feeding the bird with the bird seed on her tongue. And I mean, I was just making notes going all the way along, going, wow, well, this is quite sexual for a, for 1966, 67. And I can imagine that it caused quite a furore when it came out on the BBC at the time.
Exactly. But I think at the same time, it did, play into a lot of the ideas and myths which were being perpetuated about the Victorians at that time. There were a lot of books, like The Other Victorians by Stephen Marcus, which went on about these sort of double standards, this obsession with sex on the one hand and the prudishness on the other. So I think it was in the air.
Definitely, and I think that the 1960s in itself was a period in London and Britain where it was going through its own cultural revolutions. So not only is there a rebellion against the post-war period and sort of that feeling of rebirth that was coming through in the 1960s, but it's also a rebellion against what was seen as the standard that Britain had been sort of working to over the last 100 years as set by the Victorians. So it was rebelling against a number of things. Do you want to just tell me, inform me, because I didn't do an art history degree. I did a history degree in British culture. My specialty was 20th century British culture. So the Pre-Raphaelites are not my area of specialty. So I'd like to know more about them, and I'm sure so would our listeners. Can you just give us a bit of background? Who were the PRB? And let's go from there.
Yes, so the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was a group of artists, mainly sort of, all young men. They were barely out of their teens. They met as students at the Royal Academy schools in London, and they were dissatisfied with the way they were taught at Academy, and they felt that was reflected in the art that was produced by British artists. They felt it had become rather formulaic and stale, and they felt they wanted to return to first principles. So there's a religious aspect to this. It's almost like the idea of going back to the original Bible or to the origin. And they felt that art had become very formulaic in the way it was taught. And they felt they weren't against Raphael as such. They were against the idea of the Raphaelesque as it was taught at art schools. So they felt that artists tended to see what they painted rather than painted what they saw. And they wanted to actually look at the world afresh without it being filtered through certain rules and codes they had to absorb as students. And this explains why they painted in bright colours, on white grounds, why they were influenced by the early Italian artists who they felt were naive but more sincere and authentic, who approached their art as craftspeople rather than as precocious artists. So it's that self-consciousness of being an artist. They wanted to get beyond and approach the subject with a degree of humility. So there is a religious aspect to this as well. And of course, Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood has overtones of a monastic brotherhood or a religious order. And they felt by coming together and creating this support network where they could sort of, instruct and feed up, exchange ideas, really, literary and artistic ideas. They could develop a sort of kind of manifesto of which they could sort of launch themselves onto the artistic scene and challenge it. And in their subjects, they painted history pictures. They felt it was history painting, which is the highest in all the genres. They felt that was the most important. They agreed with that, but they wanted to make it more relevant for their day and age. And this explains why they tended to go for some British subjects. Shakespeare was, one of the key figures in their list of immortals, Keats, British writers. And they were attracted to these writers because of their interest in conflict, psychology, eroticism, sexuality. So they wanted to make the past live in the present. And this also led them on to tackle subjects from contemporary life, class conflict, prostitution, immigration, poverty. All of these subjects, came to the fore in their art. And then there was the way they painted, using these bright, discordant colours. I mean, this was completely in opposition to the way artists were taught at the academy, where they painted in brown, in oil, which was applied in a sort of fluid manner according to the teachings of Joshua Reynolds, the first president of the Royal Academy. Everything had to be hierarchically arranged. So you had key figures, subsidiary figures. But the Pre-Raphaelites turned all that on its head. So a subsidiary figure could be as important as the most significant one. So visitors, not to the academy or audiences, had to look really closely to composition and read it in a different way. So it was sort of turning on a head all the way people had been instructed or guided to read a painting. And they also took their canvases out of doors, which led to this sort of brightening up of their canvases and this sort of incredible sort of powers of observation. So there was a performative element or performative aspect to the way they painted as well. And when the work first appeared at public exhibition, they were shocking. Also because they chose their friends and associates to sit as models. And this is something Ken Russell picks up in Dante's Inferno. He didn't just use professional actors, he also used amateurs, friends. So for example, Derek Boshier, who was a pop artist, he stood in for one of the actors. Christian Logue, who was a poet, I think he performed Millais. And this is just what the Pre-Raphaelites did. They got their friends, their brothers, their fathers to stand in as models, often posing as significant characters from literature or from the Bible. And I guess one of the most controversial paintings was Millais' Christ in the House of His Parents, which was a religious subject, a fictitious religious subject, in which he got his father, other relatives to pose as the Holy Family. And he depicted them as ordinary Londoners, with Caravagesque details such as dirty fingernails, red-headed figures, which were seen to be a sign of people from the lower class or with Irish background. And this was considered shocking when it was shown at public. I think even Charles Dickens, who had a sympathy with the plight of the poor, he described the figure of the Christ child as a sort of blubbering red-headed child, and the Virgin Mary as a figure who'd wandered out of a gin shop in London. He thought that was completely inappropriate for representing the Holy Family in the traditional Raphaelesque manner, where they have some sweet angelic faces and rosebud mouths. So I think it was this attention to veins, to blood, to hair, to dirty fingernails, which made the Pre-Raphaelite paintings appear quite new and shocking, but also very modern and relevant.
What was the long-term or the longer-term impact of the Pre-Raphaelites? I mean, they started in 1848, and then they started to come apart at the seams. It wasn't that long afterwards, in the early 1850s. What happened then? Where did it go after that sort of initial sort of shock to the system that they brought the art world?
Yes, I guess there are a number of factors in play there. I think when we talk about Pre-Raphaelites being a revolutionary movement, I think we have to question that. definition. I think you could say it was just another romantic tendency. Romanticism being about the individual, individualism, and revealing aspects of life such as sexuality or eroticism, things which are not part of the public sphere. And I think that was the boldness of the Pre-Raphaelite movement. But I think after a while, this individualism, the ego of each artist began to manifest itself. And the three key artists we haven't mentioned, so sorry about that. That's Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who of course is the key subject of Dante's Inferno, William Holman Hunt and John Everett Millais. They were the key driving personalities. They all started to reveal their own sort of, separate paths. Rossetti being more concerned with imaginative subjects, particularly based on Dante and the past. On William Holman Hunt, interested in modern life, but also the Bible. He became a kind of sort of Zionist, wanting to go to the Holy Land in order to create a new kind of Protestant religious painting. And then Millais was the great poet, taking subjects from modern life, but also from literature and history, but treating them with great empathy and emotion. So, and he was the great technician of the three. So they all started to develop their own paths. And then in 1853, Millais was elected an associate of the Royal Academy. So he became part of the establishment. And that was really the watershed moment, really, when they all started to go their own ways. But by that time, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood had secured the support of the most prominent art critic of the day. That was John Ruskin. And he became their champion. And he was the one who really sort of defended the movement in arguing that instead of painting fair pictures, i.e. in the Raphaelesque manner, they painted stern facts. This is this moral underpinning of the movement. They used their eyes. They actually went out into the world and confronted what they saw. He became their great champion. And in turn, this attracted other artists into the movement who began to identify with the Pre-Raphaelite cause. So as a case really, as you often see in revolutionary movements, it starts off with a splash, with a bang, and then slowly it becomes assimilated into the mainstream.
See, that's a really interesting sort of segue into what we were talking about earlier and the way that Ken Russell uses and objectifies the female body in the film, but then how the Pre-Raphaelites started to think and explore the female body, and then how that was taken forward, obviously, within Victorian art. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? How did the female form and how it was expressed in art change over time, and how did the PRB influence that?
That's an interesting question. I think the Pre-Raphaelites, when it came to representing women, they tended to focus on the face and on the gesture, I think is the key thing. They were interested in psychology and in the idea of the individual. So when you look at Pre-Raphaelite painting, and take Millais' famous painting Ophelia hanging in Tate Britain. What is astonishing about that painting is you have to sort of look at it in two ways. On the one hand, you look at it and you say, that is Shakespeare's Ophelia drowning in the stream. You look at it again and you say, oh, that's Elizabeth Siddal in the bathtub, posing in Millais' studio in Gower Street, as seen in Ken Russell's film. And there's a sort of disjuncture between the two. You have this almost doppelganger effect. Is it Ophelia or is it Elizabeth Siddal? And that's because Millais was so fixed on the expression, or in doing a portrait really of Elizabeth Siddal. And that's credit to her as well, because she was a brilliant actress, or actor, you could say. She knew how to sort of impersonate that role, or to really step into it. So she was, if you feel that in posing in the bathtub, she felt she was the drowning Ophelia. So that's her skill, you could say, as an artist too. But to get back to your question, their interest in the expression, in physiognomy, in psychology. So that's for the Pre-Raphaelites. When it comes to the sort of the body, if you're thinking about the sort of the nude, that's something which sort of slightly develops later, where artists of perhaps of a slightly later generation played down the idea of the face or physiognomy in expression in favour of the body as a more abstract form, and how that could communicate the idea of beauty in terms of line, in terms of texture. And there's a tension between the sort of formal qualities of the body and what it is actually representing, i.e. a scene of abduction, violence, or whatever. So I think it's really during the course of the 19th century, artists come back to the classical tradition of the nude, which the Pre-Raphaelites rejected. Remember, they looked back to sort of early Christian art, where you didn't really get the nude. The nude was to do with sin and sexuality. But then later on, there's a rediscovery of classicism, of the High Renaissance. And that's when you get this renewed interest in the nude, both female and male.
That's fascinating. I always find it really interesting to sort of think about the Pre-Raphaelites and how as you said, their focus on facial expressions, on that gestures, those postures, actually belie, as you said, that psychology behind it. The sort of what you see on the oils on the canvas is a veil for all of this sort of human condition exploration sort of behind it. So I think that's what's really, I think, really beautiful about Dante's Inferno as well, is that it's a film about Elizabeth Siddal, isn't it? And with her, as you said, the Twiggy of 1848, and the way that she was filmed, you can see that, but there's a hauntedness to her that I think is really lovely, that manages to capture the the quote unquote reality of the paintings as well. How do you feel about how men tell women's stories through art, whether that's film or on canvas?
Yes, well, if we go back to the Russell film, how a woman portrayed in that, well, I think you've got Elizabeth Siddal, who is a victim. Even though he does sort of, there's a certain modernity to her as well, and that she's a rather sort of pert Cockney girl at the same time. And she also has this a creative aspect to her as well. She's obviously an artist who secures the patronage of Ruskin. But I think on the whole, she is seen to be there's a pathetic side to her. How she can't cope with Rossetti's sort of sexual passion and roving eye for other women, so she resorts to drug taking, and it's through drug taking she becomes ill and then commits suicide. So she is the victim. And then you have other women like Annie Miller and Fanny Cornforth, who are seducers, who are sort of luscious, hearty girls who are on for a good time. So I think Fanny Cornforth comes across as being a bit of a helpmeet as well, and she looks after Rossetti when he becomes addicted to drugs. And Annie Miller just wants a good time, so she's unfaithful to Holman Hunt. She's a flirt. So I think it's this idea that women are these opposites, really. They're either sort of I say tarts, or they are there's something pathetic about them. They're victims. And it's interesting, Elizabeth Siddal is someone who she in the film she shows wanting to withdraw from any sexual relation with Rossetti at the beginning. So she's like the sort of the virgin as opposed to the whore who you see in the other figures. And so you get these two stereotypes who sort of clash throughout the film.
And you've also got Rossetti's sister in the film, Christina,
exactly, yes.
as well, who is very much this sort of
she's she's stern matron standing.
very, very, very very sort of strict, judgmental. It's almost as she represented the sort of the early Victorian male eye on women, and sort of this is what is appropriate and this is what is not, even though actually poor Elizabeth Siddal was desperately trying to keep a lid on
Yes.
all of this and remain respectable as
Yes,
well.
I think this idea that women were torn between these two, these two polar opposites, really. Either the idea of the angel in the house, the woman who was sort of, virginal, who lived alone, who was sort of moral and pure, like Christina Rossetti, and then you have the sexualized woman. And I
Mm-hmm.
think, someone like Elizabeth Siddal is somehow torn between the two, because in becoming a Pre-Raphaelite, becoming an artist, she sort of joins this monastic order, in a sense. At the same time, she loves Rossetti. So she's torn between these two different kind of vocations, as it were, between being the wife and then between being the mistress. And I think that's the artist's play on that idea of women being put in this difficult position of having a moral choice. And you often see that in Pre-Raphaelite paintings. I mean, the Holman Hunt's famous The Awakening Conscience, for which Annie Miller posed. It's about a fallen woman who's seen the folly of her way. Will she be saved through Christ, or will she just descend for the social order and end up drowning in the Thames? So there's a narrative element to all these pictures. This is what's so interesting about the Pre-Raphaelites. It's not just weren't just artists; they were also writers, and their paintings were devised to be read like books. They had this complex network of symbols and signs which had to be sort of decoded. And that's what makes them so fascinating, I think, to us today. That how we, with the distance of time, how we read these pictures and how they were sort of perceived at the day. So I think coming back to the idea of how women were or portrayed, there's been a lot of writing about this. Some think, oh, women were objectified. It's men who are creating the narratives for women. But what about women creating their own narratives? And this is something you see through the women artists who join the movement. They were obviously attracted to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood or the Pre-Raphaelite movement because it was sort of conceived partly as had this amateur aspect to it. And so a lot of women were drawn into it as wives, as helpmeets, as daughters, as friends and associates, and they developed their own narrative. So if you look at Elizabeth Siddal's pictures, for example, they often concern women and women's agency. So women become the sort of, the narrators. They conduct the narrative. They're not always seen as being passive victims or seductresses. So that's quite important. And then also they become innovators in their own right. So recently it's been argued that rather than Elizabeth Siddal being a pupil of Rossetti, he learned from her because she had this very sort of, naive way of painting, but naivety being a strength. You get these sort of angular, spiky figures. That arguably is something Rossetti picks up from Elizabeth Siddal. And then the way she composes with these angular figures, these sort of simple expressions. There's a quite strong abstract quality to her work and something very emotive too. So I think you can see them as two artists working in partnership. And that's perhaps a more sort of holistic way to look at the movement, rather than it just being a narrative of male geniuses. There were these women who joined the movement as artists, but also as craftspeople as well, and also as managers. And so it was a collective movement in which you had men and women participating equally.
And I think you see that in sort of the wider romantic period as well. Things like Mary Shelley, there are many more women writers coming to the fore, whilst, appreciate people like, George Eliot who are still publishing under male names. This, the early Victorian period and the very late sort of Georgian period, was, where we saw Austen, is where we've seen the Brontes. We've seen this sort of coming to light of women's artistic agency in this as well, and challenging those archetypes. I will just say something that I find quite astounding is on social media still today, they still put out a load of old tosh about women, female archetypes. What archetype are you? Are you the mother? Are you the virgin? Are you the lover? And it's just like, oh my God. And when it frightens me that this is going on TikTok, on Instagram, and that there are young women these days still getting and men being fed. This is like, no, the
Yes,
archetypes are exactly that. They do not exist.
yes.
Okay. They only exist in people's minds, and they
Yes,
are,
but I suppose
you know,
those archetypes are so
creations.
deeply ingrained over time, they are
Mhm,
very difficult to sort of, nudge or what to shift. That's what's so interesting about the Victorian era, because I think everything
mm,
came up for grabs in this at this time,
mm,
because there's a move towards a more democratic society, and art moves into the public sphere. So everything becomes politicized at this time. And of course, it was the 19th century. You have the development of the so-called feminist movement, when women
mhm.
were campaigning for, sort of divorce rights, marriage rights, equal pay. All of this comes to the fore at that time. And of course, art was, part of that sort of wider movement for greater representation.
Absolutely. I think it's 1849. I might get my dates wrong on this one, but this the Seneca Convention was the first sort of big sort of stepping stone in the American women's suffrage movement as well. So this is I I find this period of time, against the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution, this idea of this age, coming out of this age of reason, this age of science, supposedly, actually also spawns this age of really sort of looking to ourselves as well, and looking to ourselves not just as archetypes, but as human beings. And I think that's the part that I find so incredibly inspiring about the time. And whilst I don't necessarily go with the whole sort of romantic movement, we want to go back to simpler times before that, I do really uh, find it fascinating and inspiring about how they want to look to emotions, and in many ways are exploring human emotion, not just male emotion, not just male gaze, but actually the agency of women in that as well.
Yes. I think experience is the key word here.
Mm,
Artists want to draw on their own experiences as well
yeah,
as, their own relationships and how they interact with others in the social world, as well as within the
absolutely.
family.
So let's fast forward a little bit to what do you think has changed versus not changed in terms of the artistic world? And this is a huge question, I know. So please feel free to answer however you like. Changed, or and more particularly not changed in that time period, to how um, contemporary art is seen today, or maybe we'll take it up to the 1960s because we're just opening up a huge can of worms there. But I'm curious to know how you've seen that impact of that period of time come through, and sort of what still remains and what doesn't.
Well, I think if just continuing the thread of the previous conversation about, the representation of women, there's been a complete change. Women have really come to the fore in art making. And you think of, most museums, as part of their programs, they'll have monographic shows or solo artist exhibitions on women artists, obviously rediscovering of neglected artists. So I think women artists is a really big theme now. People are really interested in the work of, the women Pre-Raphaelite artists, but also modern contemporary artists. But at the same time, um, the images of women or women's bodies are still used to promote art and other commodities. And it's quite interesting in, recent exhibitions on the Pre-Raphaelites. You will, any exhibition on the Pre-Raphaelites will always have a Rossetti image of a stunner to promote the show, rather than a work by a female artist, for instance. So I think it's quite interesting how, sexualized images of women are still used to promote art. And I think that's interesting. That's quite telling. But at the same time, now I think you could say, I think a lot of people would argue that men and women are quite equal in the art world, that there's a lot of attention given to women artists. So there's been a bit of a sea change there, I would say. As for sort of talking about politics and art, you might say we talk about the Victorians as being a bit sort of prudish or moral or censorious, but I would say not as much as we are today. I think in that sense, history doesn't go forward, it goes backwards and forward. Nowadays, there's a great sensitivity about certain subjects you can't show, images of pubescent children, girls, boys, that's a no-go area. A lot of museums now have to have warning signs before you confront certain images. So they're not seen to be safe spaces. And I think that is slightly problematic, because we think of art as it's developed in the Western world, it's about freedom of expression. And I think, I personally think when you go into an art museum, you should be prepared to be surprised. You don't know what you're going to confront, and that's your decision you make when you step over that particular threshold. But you might say the museums are now slightly sort of retreating from that point of view and thinking, oh dear, how are we going to meet our audience? How are we going to prepare them? How are we going to justify ourselves? How are we going to apologize for what we are on showing? And I think that's rather restrictive, I think, particularly for creativity. So I think in that sense, we are the new Victorians, or even more without the Victorians, you could say.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I think the role and responsibility of museums and galleries these days is to do exactly what you just said, which is, how do we meet our audience? How do we prepare them? But also, I don't think that we should be censoring ourselves, because that goes against the whole sort of exploration of art and humanity and the human condition in the first place. And if we end up censoring ourselves now, are we not actually just committing the same, crime as we have in the past by censoring other people's voices that weren't, representative at the time? Actually, how do we have those balanced conversations now? And how do we support people who may feel, difficult feelings when exposed to certain kinds of art? I think that's the role we play, is how do we psychologically, emotionally, and intellectually support and explore those feelings, rather than try and pretend that those feelings aren't there. I think that's where we need to be a bit more nuanced.
Yes. I think it's going to be an ongoing problem, because this is what happens when art enters the public sphere. In the past, when art was produced for the royalty or the aristocracy, for an elite, artists could be quite bold in what they represented, because they were catering to a group of connoisseurs or aristocrats with a particular taste. Once you put something in the public, people are going to approach it in many different ways, and some people are going to be offended. And so it's how you police that. You police those different viewpoints.
Absolutely. And how do you support those different viewpoints to be held,
Yeah.
as well?
And do you privilege one above another? That's the dilemma.
Absolutely. So, Alison, we're almost coming to the end of our wonderful episode together, and I'm sure that my listeners would love to know what you thought were the Pre-Raphaelite artworks to go and see, and the wider sort of romantic period. What are the things that you love about that, and what would you recommend other people seek out as as a way in to the romantic period?
Well, I think with the Pre-Raphaelites, they're all over London, and no, not all, when I say all over London, I mean you go to the Tate mainly to see the great Pre-Raphaelite works. On Millais' Ophelia, I think that never ceases to astonish people, because of its poignancy and its deep, rich, saturated colour. Those greens and the attention to detail is marvellous. We also have to remember that the Pre-Raphaelites made their reputation outside of London, in the industrial cities of the Midlands and the North. So you go to Birmingham, you go to Manchester, you go to Liverpool, where you see incredible paintings such as Ford Madox Brown's work, which is a wonderful critique of the way the society is structured according to sort of social class. There's paintings in sort of Scotland. I mentioned Birmingham. We've got the wonderful Holman Hunt paintings that just Christ, the temple picture. So they're amazing pictures all around the country. So I think I would invite people to just get on a train and travel from London to the Midlands and the North to seek out these pictures.
Oh, I love that. I think I might have to go on a Pre-Raphaelite
Pre-Raphaelite
tour.
trail,
So,
yes. And
yeah,
then you can
exactly.
if you want to take it further, you go to places like Oxford, and you see the wonderful stained glass by Burne-Jones and Morris, in churches throughout the country. So it's not just paintings in galleries. The Pre-Raphaelite influence extended to architecture and the applied and decorative arts as well, and sculpture.
I think I think I'm definitely going to do that because I'm about to tell you something that I don't think you know about me, but I am the great granddaughter of Robert Herdman Smith, who went and was one of the artistic founders of the New Zealand School of Art. And he was part of the St. Ives School, and he had a particular interest in sort of Orientalism and sort of how that came out of that sort of later Victorian, early 20th century period. So I think I'm going to have to do a trail from the early Romantics through the Pre-Raphaelites all the way through to my great granddad, who was born in just outside of Liverpool. So thank you, Alison. That has been wonderful story today. I've really enjoyed that. And yesterday I was listening to Wordsworth and Tennyson and Blake being read out loud not out loud, on my earbuds, whilst I was on a plane, and the sort of the way that sort of romantic poetry and romantic art can just still make your heart soar, I think is an amazing feeling, and people shouldn't forget it. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a great day, and thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.